right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm the events coordinator, Benjamin Johnson, here from McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is being held on Treaty 6 territory, which is the land of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. As we listen to our speakers share their words today, may we also keep in mind the Indigenous stories that have been shared on this land since time immemorial. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Through Winds of Prairie Dust by Brenda Butler, published by Glass and Height Publications. Thank you so much to Brenda for being here and for working with us to make this event happen, as well as to Cindy Gertson. Did I pronounce that right? Perfect, awesome. Our gracious host for this evening. Just to note, this event is being live streamed, so please be aware of the webcam off to your right. Please also take a moment to silence your phones. If you would like to buy a copy of Through Winds of Prairie Dust, you can find them on the signing table behind me over here, as well as on the desk by where you first walked in. You're welcome to get your book signed before you purchase it, but, and I cannot emphasize this enough, please purchase it if you get it signed. Shouldn't have to say it, but I do. We will be kicking off this event with a discussion led by Cindy, followed by a reading from Brenda and a Q&A after that. If you have any questions you'd like to ask our author during the Q&A, please don't be shy. Raise your hand. I'll be happy to run the microphone to you. And now to introduce both our author and host. Born and raised in Saskatchewan, Brenda Butler spent 30 years living in the Yukon before moving to Ottawa. Since childhood, Brenda has been intrigued by the mysteries surrounding her maternal grandparents. A grandfather who disappeared after leaving home to search for work in the 1930s, and a grandmother who was committed to the notorious Weyburn Mental Hospital only a few years later. After Brenda retired, she began researching the possibilities of what could have been her grandparents' stories. The result is this, her debut novel, Through Winds of Prairie Dust. Cindy Gertson is a retired teacher and has been best friends with Brenda since childhood for more decades than they could count. Everyone, please give them a warm welcome.
So I just wanted to give a bit of a research into my family's history. It's a historical fiction mystery set mostly in Saskatchewan during the 1930s to 40s. It tells the story of Marit and Anders, Norwegian immigrants with a son and daughter. It explores the dark history of one of Saskatchewan's notorious mental asylums, as well as the On to Ottawa trek and the Regina riot. It begins in 1934, and Anders, a farmhand by trade who has been unemployed for over a year, leaves his family in search of work. Instead, he finds that there are no jobs and discovers a world he didn't know existed. 5 years later, his wife Marit and their 2 children still wait for his return when Marit falls victim to Saskatchewan's 1936 Mental Hygiene Act.
First of all, thank you for letting me share this evening with you. And my first question for you is, what is the book about? What is the book about?
Well, but yeah. Yeah, as I was just saying, it's about the Saskatchewan notorious mental asylum and the On to Ottawa trek and the Regina riot, but it's about the conditions that people faced during the 1930s, during the Depression, and the hardships that they had to deal with, and the way it affected them.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, what inspired you to write this particular book, Brenda? You touched on that already, but
let's go into that a little more. To me, this is a story that's been burning to be told most of my life. It all began when I was 11 years old, and I was on a long drive with my dad, and that's when he first told me about the family mystery. My maternal grandfather had left home to search for work, and when my mother was very young, and he left his wife and 4 children. He disappeared and was never heard from again. Dad told me that my maternal grandmother had had what they called a nervous breakdown. A few years after that, ended up in the mental hospital in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. The sad conclusion was that my mother and her siblings were sent to an orphanage and then to separate foster homes where they were mistreated. My mother was the oldest of 4. By then she was 12 years old, and they never lived with their mother again. My grandmother died when my mother was a young adult. So that was it. There's all these questions that my siblings and I had about what happened? What happened to our grandfather? Did he just decide to abandon his family? Had something happened to him? What led to our grandmother's breakdown and being committed to a mental hospital? Unfortunately, there were no answers to these questions. Over the years, our mother would share what she knew about all of this, but her stories were inconsistent. None of them made sense or fit together. Later, I came to understand that her memory had very likely been affected by her childhood trauma, which explained her inconsistent family mystery that no one much talked about because it was painful and it was unresolved. About 5 to 6 years ago, I was working on completing my degree, finally, and had decided to take a course on the history of Western Canada. In one of the textbooks, I came across a few pages that talked about mental asylums in Saskatchewan during the Depression and the terrible experiences that patients had there. This immediately caught my attention, of course, because I thought of my grandmother. And I read a brief blurb about Saskatchewan's Mental Diseases Act that was created in 1930. Here's a brief overview of the act. In the Mental Diseases Act, if a person believed someone they knew was mentally ill or behaving in a manner not safe for themselves or someone else, then they could go to a justice of the peace and make a statement under oath, and the JP could then order the alleged unstable person to be taken to see a doctor, where they would be assessed and then kept in an asylum. There was also a Mental Defectives Act for people who had what was considered an arrested or incomplete development of their mind. These acts were later replaced with the Mental Hygiene Act of 1936. The only difference really from the previous acts was that 2 doctor signatures were now required to commit someone, and a patient could commit themselves. The textbook passage then explained that many people had been unfairly institutionalized for a variety of reasons, including discrimination and cultural racism.
Wow. Can you tell us about the process you underwent to write this story?
Yes, finding this information in the textbook is when the story first began to take root in my head. I decided to get a copy of my grandmother's medical record from the asylum. What I discovered from her record is that it was quite possible that she had been a victim of the Mental Hygiene Act, mainly because there were questions that the doctor had asked her, and her answers saying that a neighbor would come into their house and abuse her and the children. And I don't know what that meant. I don't know to what extent, but it was quite possible that this neighbor had possibly made some kind of an accusation against her. And then there was a list of accusations that she apparently had done. So of course, there's no way of knowing what the truth was in all of this. But the more I researched it, the more the story began to take form. I originally planned it as a short story, but by the time I'd finished Marit's tale, it had become the length of a novella. My family encouraged me also to tell my grandfather's story. I admit that I found it more intimidating because it was so open-ended. And I essentially had one sentence. He left home and disappeared. I didn't know what to do with that. So I did, however, have some of our grandfather's family history, which I'd received from a relative in Norway. This helped to form the character of Anders. And one idea I had in my head is that if he left home during the Depression, he was very likely a drifter. So I started reading about the era and discovered some fabulous information, including firsthand experiences of the On to Ottawa trek and the Regina riot. And I became intrigued. I was so fascinated by this important chapter in Canadian history. And once again, felt like it was a tale I wanted to tell. But also, it seemed a possibility that our grandfather could have become involved in such an adventure. When I was finished his story, I essentially had a second novella on my hands. That was when I decided to weave the two together. And while I was at it, tell the story of the kids. Of course, although the work was rooted in real people's experiences, it had become a complete work of fiction. I took further liberties, changing the number of children and what happened to them, the names of the characters, and even the setting. Something else that grew along the way is the inclusion of folk songs. My grandfather had been a musician, according to our mother, so I made Anders one as well, and I included lyrics from popular folk songs from that era. Then our son, Jesse, who is a poet with a published book of his own, wrote some lyrics for a song in the book, which he called Through the Dust. What I liked best about that was there were two versions, the original version and then a worker's version that Andrew sang while being part of the trek to spur on the other trekkers. I really liked the way the music gave the book more of a feel for those times.
When writing this book, which passage gave you the most difficulty?
Okay, well, I admit I cried buckets writing this book. I found the entire novel difficult to write because of the subject matter. But the part I found the most difficult was the kids, having them taken from their mother. So I had the social worker waiting in the wings, and I was all ready for this to happen. And I couldn't do it. I kept seeing their little faces, and I had to keep reminding myself, they're fictional characters. You made them up. They had become so real to me. I just couldn't bear to have them be sent to a foster home where they would be mistreated as my mother and her siblings had been. So I finally decided that I was going to have to come up with another solution. So I did, and they still underwent a lot of hardship, but it was a kinder solution than what I had originally planned.
And what can readers expect?
As already mentioned, Through Winds of Prairie Dust explores some of Canada's and specifically Saskatchewan's dark history. So there is a lot of sadness, but it's also a story about love and forgiveness.
And what do you hope readers will take away from your book?
First of all, the story reveals a social, economic, and political climate in the 1930s that shares many challenges Canadians face today: growing joblessness, homelessness, public mental health interventions, and occasional police brutality, all of which were largely ignored by the then Prime Minister R.B. Bennett. As I already alluded to, it looks at how nearly a century ago the government mishandled the problems of thousands of men without work who were marginalized and ended up in forestry labor relief camps, the mental health legislation that allowed doctors to experiment with new therapies and so-called cures for the mentally ill, and the high proportion of women who allegedly exhibited signs of mental illness were forcibly imprisoned without means of appeal. So I hope the reader finds the book relevant to today, but what's most important to me in all of this is the book contains stories of real people, of course with critical details changed, whether they are about patients in a mental asylum or men caught up in political turmoil that took place roughly 100 years ago. These are human stories that I think need to be heard. All right. So I'm going to read two passages from the book, mainly about the two main protagonists, Anders and Marit. So the first one will be about Anders, and I want to just give a quick description of the character. He's a deeply conflicted man. He was raised by an abusive father, and he's afraid of becoming like him. And that's the driving force behind his decision to leave his family. He becomes pulled into the trek in a desperate bid to prove to himself that he can become a different person. So in this passage, it's 1934, and Anders has just left his wife and children in search of work, only to find that there are no jobs. He falls in with a hobo called Mac and is just about to experience his first hobo jungle and will soon be adopting his new nickname, Swede, which which Mac has given him. Anders and Mac crossed the river at the traffic bridge and trudged to Lorne Avenue. It was a long walk, and they were both tired when they saw the jungle. It was situated between the rail yards and the river. Groups of men were sitting around fires close to what looked like piles of debris. "I hope my pals are here," Mac said. As they got closer, Anders saw that the piles of debris were actually shelters. They were made from an odd assortment of materials: rusty sheets of tin, pieces of plywood, cardboard, and broken boards. Mac nudged Anders. He pointed to one of the groups by a fire, and they walked toward them. A short, slight man with red hair was stirring something in a pot over the flames. He looked up as they approached. "Well, as I live and breathe, if it isn't Mac," he exclaimed. Mac smiled and walked over to the red-headed man. "Hello, Mulligan. It's been too long." "It has," Mulligan replied with a broad smile, shaking hands with Mac and slapping him on the back. "I'm just cooking up some of my famous Mulligan stew, so you're just in time." "We've got some bread to go with it." Mac took the loaves out of his haversack. "We tried to get more food, but didn't have any luck." Two other men had been sitting on the ground nearby, but when they saw Mac, they stood up and rushed over to greet him. After shaking hands with them, Mac turned to Anders and said, "This is my friend Sweet." He introduced Anders to the others, who both looked to be in their 20s to 30s, and, like Anders and Mac, wore tattered clothes and cloth caps. Slim was tall and thin, with straight dark hair and a serious face, while Lucky was short and stocky, with thick curly hair. When he was introduced, Lucky said to Anders with a chuckle, "If I didn't have bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all." Anders grinned at him and said hello. Then he took off his guitar and rucksack and set them on the ground. They all sat down, and while they waited for the food to finish cooking, Mac and his friends got caught up on how they had spent the previous months. The sun was beginning to set when Mulligan announced that the meal was ready. The men all hungrily milled around the pot while Mulligan dished it up. Anders saw that the other men had tin cans and spoons for eating. He had nothing to use and held back, not knowing what to do. When the others had dished out, Mulligan looked at Anders. "Do you have something to chow down with?" he asked. When Anders quietly shook his head, Mulligan turned and went into a nearby shelter made from sheets of plywood and cardboard. He emerged with a can and a spoon, which he handed to Anders. "This belonged to Smiley, but he hasn't been around for a while, so you may as well have it." "Thank you," Anders said, as Mulligan filled his can with a hearty soup. It contained carrots, potatoes, and some kind of meat. Anders didn't know what it was and didn't care. He was so hungry he would have eaten anything. When everyone had eaten their fill of soup and bread, they leaned back and relaxed. Mulligan turned to Anders and nodded at his guitar. "Do you play that thing?" he asked. "Yes," Anders said. He loved playing music almost more than anything in the world and didn't need much encouragement. He began with Red River Valley. Most of the others knew the song and joined in. Then he played his own favorite, a song he'd written for the Depression called "Through the Dust." "Oh, the wind whips the dust up until I can't see the sky or my home or the road. I want to turn back, but a man can't be free until he's delivered what's owed. It's the only way I know, and so I must go through the dust. And so I'll keep walking, although my eyes sting, and each little breath is a chore. I'll march through the whirlwind, and still I will sing, 'cause I know who I'm journeying for. The ones I love are waiting for me, just beyond the dust." When he finished the song, Anders looked around. In the growing dark, he could see the other men's faces in the flickering light cast by pick it up. Hiking, and he said, "Boys, I'm not turning. I'm headed for a land that's far away beside the crystal fountains. So come with me. We'll go and see the Big Rock Candy Mountains." When they reached the second verse, Anders was playing along. They all enjoyed the song so much they decided to sing it again. Then once they were in a happier frame of mind, they began to discuss their plans for the coming winter. The second portion that I'll be reading is about Marit. Marit is gracious, kind, and somewhat feisty. She somehow remains optimistic despite being put into an increasingly vulnerable position. As she cares for their 2 children on her own, it is her strength and determination that helps her to see through it all. That helps to see her through it all, but it also becomes her downfall. In this passage is 1939, and Marit has been raising her children, Charlotte 9 and Edward 12, for some years. Earlier that day, Edward was caught up in an incident with his friend Jack and involving their neighbor, Henry Calloway. Edward arrived home an hour later when Marit was just starting supper. One look at his face told her that something was amiss. "What's wrong?" she asked him. He stood there looking at her and shrugged. She walked over to him and, placing her hand on his shoulder, raised her eyebrows. He looked her in the eye and motioned with his head to one side, meaning that he needed to talk to her alone. Without a word, they both walked to her room and shut the door. "Mama," he said and gulped. She nodded, and so he continued, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was Jack's idea. I said no, and then he called me a chicken." "All right, tell me what happened." "Jack dared me to steal something from Mr. Bauer's store." "Oh, Edward, you didn't." He shook his head no. "I just went with Jack to talk him out of it, but he ignored me and stole a pocket knife, and Mr. Calloway saw him." "Mr. Calloway?" Merit had been concerned, but now she was afraid. Henry Calloway was capable of causing all sorts of trouble. "What was he doing there?" "He was looking at some tools nearby." "What happened then?" "Mr. Calloway started yelling. Then Mr. Bauer came to find out what was going on. I told Mr. Bauer that I hadn't taken anything, and I apologized. Jack just stood there. He didn't say anything. Anyway, Mr. Bauer wasn't too upset. He believed me, said there was no harm done because Jack had put the knife back. But Mr. Calloway was really mad. Jack and I just ran out of there, and I came straight home. Jack is going to be in trouble with his dad." "Well, it's a shame but Jack should have thought about that before he started such shenanigans." She hugged Edward. "It will be all right. Go do your homework until supper." Merit went back to preparing the meal and tried not to worry. Some folks said Henry Calloway was born mean-spirited, while others said living with spiteful old Thelma made him the way he was. It seemed the 2 of them bred malice the way others bore children. Compared to Thelma's tall figure and looming ill will, Henry was slight of build and considerably shorter than his wife, yet Henry somehow managed to be the more threatening of the 2. Perhaps it was the dark hatred in his eyes, or maybe it was the sneer in his face when he'd been drinking. But then, seeing as he was drunk most of the time, the sneer seemed to be a permanent fixture. Most likely it was just his contempt for all living things that made people cross the street to avoid him when they saw him coming. Merit wished she could avoid him until this blew over, but feared she wouldn't be so lucky. After supper, they were in the kitchen washing the dishes when Henry Calloway stormed into their house. He seemed angry. His clothes were disheveled, and he staggered slightly. He smelled of alcohol. "Merit Johansson, your son is a common thief," he shouted. Merit faced Henry while gently pushing Edward behind her and forced herself to speak calmly. "No, Henry, he isn't. He told me what happened. His friend tried to steal something, but Edward didn't. He needs a man to discipline him." Henry took a few steps toward them. "No, Henry, he's a good boy. Please leave us alone and go home." Henry took another step forward and pushed her aside forcefully. She bounced off the table and fell to the floor. Charlotte started to cry and ran to her mother. When Edward saw his mother fall, he became angry. At 12 years old, he was big for his age and was starting to resemble his father. He stood as tall as he could and was almost as tall as Henry Calloway. He looked Henry directly in the eye. "Don't you push my mother around," he said in a quiet voice. "Don't you tell me what to do, you young punk." With that, Henry lifted a hand and hit Edward across the face. Merit was filled with rage. How dare Henry strike her son? Behind her was a wood box. It held mostly kindling. There was one piece of wood that was big enough to be a club. She picked it up and ran at Henry, swinging it. It bounced off his shoulder, grazing his face and knocking off his glasses. "Get out," she yelled at him, swinging the club once more, "and don't ever hit my children again." Henry staggered back to avoid her swing, then bent over and quickly picked up his glasses. As he stood, he yelled back at her, "What are you doing swinging weapons around like that? Your whole family's a menace." Then he stood quietly staring at her. "You're crazy and dangerous." His face wore a triumphant expression. "No," Merit said, dropping the club. "Please leave and don't ever raise a hand against us again." Henry turned and staggered out. The three of them stood and looked at each other. None of them said a word. Mama, Charlotte finally asked. It's going to be all right, Marit said as calmly as she could. Let's finish the dishes.
Great. So if anyone has any questions from our audience, please feel free to raise a hand. I'll come to you with the microphone.
No pressure.
Perfect.
I was just curious, in writing this book, were there topics that you researched that you hadn't been aware of, and then you got into more depth in that basically maybe triggered possibilities of using in some future books? Or
Well, not necessarily in future books, but I did discover things about the asylum that I found absolutely shocking. And so that's sort of what ended up being put into the book that I had never anticipated. Things like children being housed in a mental asylum with dangerous patients and really very little protection for them. So that type of thing, and people in an asylum and called, mentally defective, and they probably just had a learning disability, or maybe their English wasn't their first language, and so that kind of stuff where it just, holy, like, how does that happen? So yes, but I don't think they would end up in a future book. They ended up just in this one.
Are there any plans for future books?
I do have another book that I've written and edited, and I'm hoping to get published.
That's awesome. Any other questions from our audience? I have another question, actually. If you could go back to this time period, would you want to? Is there anything that, what makes you not want to visit there, or what would make you want to visit this sort of period in Canadian history?
Oh golly. Well, just the reality of, people being separated, husbands, so many men, itinerant men, separated from their families, homeless. It was just so sad. People trying to get by with so little, sewing clothes from flour sacks. I mean, it was wonderful how resourceful they were, but it was also very sad, the hardships that they had to live with. Although I have to admit that when I listen to the music from that era, there's a charm in that for sure.
Totally. Oh,
How did you get started with the writing process? Like, where did you even know where to start?
Golly. I guess before I ever sit down at a computer, I'm writing it in my head. So that's where it starts, is just sort of thinking what could happen? How do I want this to look? And then I start writing in my head and then going, well, no, it should be like this. Well, no, it should be like that. And then once I start getting an idea, then I sit down and start to write. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I just know it, like when you write a novel like that, hard to imagine where it starts.
I guess it starts with an idea, and you have an idea of where you want it to start and where you want it to end. And how are you going to get there? So that's sort of where, like in this case, I had an ending because because I knew what happened with our grandparents. But so I guess that in that sense it was a little bit easier because the ending was sort of written, except I ended up making it a happier ending. But yeah.
how about sorry. How about, just to follow up on that, how about the research process? Like, where do you
the U of S library. Some of my former colleagues are here, and looking at what information they had. And my favorite was a thesis written by Alex Dayton called The Last Asylum, and it was about the Weyburn Asylum pretty much during that period. And so that was sort of the starting point. And then I read a book on the Depression written by Pierre Burton, just to get a sense of what was going on during that time. And then once I started getting intrigued with the Ottawa trek, then I read a first person account written by Ron, I think it's Ron Liver's Edge. And so that was really interesting too. So just sort of starting there. And then of course, I found like I could never get more than a few pages where I'd be thinking, wait a minute, what would they be eating? Well, what were they wearing? What were the styles like? And so I had to keep, or then my sister's here, so I keep looking at her, but our dad was still living. And so I would call him up and say, how did they heat their houses back then? And, so that kind of thing. So I kept sort of finding myself, stymied and having to look up. So I hope
just kind of a continuous process of research.
Continuous, absolutely. Yeah.
You're never quite done.
Yes, that's right.
Are there any other questions from our audience? Oh, perfect. I'll run all the way over there. Oh, sure.
I don't have a question. I just want to say I've read the book and I just couldn't put it down.
Oh, thank you, David. And there's no connect, like I've never met this. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, Brenda from way back here.
Oh, hi.
I just the Weyburn Mental Institution. I'm a tradesperson, a woman. I've been in the trades for 25, 50 years, and 50 years actually. And I remember the Weyburn Mental was a tradesperson place where you went to get training. Do you know anything about that history?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's something to look into. Like, it was 1980s, mid 80s.
So did you spend time in there then?
I did. It was not very nice.
Yeah, I was gonna say, was it creepy?
It was very creepy.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I had this idea that, it'd be so great, well, not great, but interesting to go and actually see it, and then discovered it had been torn down. But someone had actually gone in and taken pictures of it before it was torn down. So I did get to see it. But yeah, it looked creepy. Definitely.
Do we have, perfect.
When you talked about Weyburn Mental Hospital, it reminded me of a woman by the name of Kay Parley. And I don't know whether you've heard of her, but she was an inmate for a certain period of time with manic depression. And afterwards, she really liked her stay there, believe it or not. And both her father and her grandfather had manic depressive issues as well. And she met her father for the first time in the hospital, and he had been in the hospital since she was 7. Now she ended up becoming a psychiatric nurse herself, and she was part of an LSD experiment which went on at the
they did do that.
Hospital.
Yeah.
But anyway, she just died. She was on CBC radio, and I heard her interviewed there one time.
Wow.
And she was spoke very, very articulate lady. And she just died not all that long ago at 102.
Wow, isn't that something? Well, and then it's something I did discover there is a website for that asylum. I can't remember what it's called now off the top of my head, but and of course, because it was written from that perspective, it was a very rosy picture was painted of how wonderful it was and how great it was with the community, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but what I did gather from that is there were some good things that happened there. Like there were some nice social events and that kind of thing. So it wasn't always a complete nightmare. So maybe, maybe that's what struck a chord with this person.
It is interesting how many people throughout the province have been touched by Weyburn Mental Hospital in some way, shape, or form. So yeah. Any other final questions? Maybe we can do one more. Yeah, perfect.
Hi, I think you already said this, but I want to know how much of it is the truth, like the real story, and you kind of will wove it in somehow.
Okay, so there's probably about 3 or 4 pages of truth, because there's what I got from from our grandmother's medical records, and the one sentence of my grandfather leaving, and a little bit from our mother, but not much. So yeah, like there's really only a few pages of actual honest to God truth. Although, I mean, there's all the research, like the truth that comes from the research, but the actual family part of the truth, I should clarify, is but there's the truth from the research.
All right, fantastic. Well, this has been so awesome. Thank you all for coming here. Yeah, round of applause. My goodness. If you have any other questions or comments for Brenda, I'm sure she'd be happy to take your questions and comments at the signing table at the back. Just a reminder that we have books here at the front, as well as at the signing table. You can't pay for them here, just up at the front, but you're welcome to get them signed beforehand. And yeah, thank you to both Brenda and Cindy for being here and for such a fantastic event. One more round of applause.
I just had a few, because you just can't get rid of me. I have a few concluding remarks. First of all, I wanted to thank everyone at McNally Robinson and my publisher, Jonathan Siley at Galassanite Pubs for organizing this event. A special thank you to my dear friend Cindy for standing with me or sitting with me this evening. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for being a part of this journey with me and for helping to celebrate tonight. Without the encouragement of friends and family, this story would still just be a family mystery stuck in my head. So, and I've one final request to make, and that is if you enjoy reading through Winds of Prairie Dust and its message resonates with you, I'd love for you to share your thoughts. Word of mouth and reviews means the world to an author. So please tell your friends, consider leaving a review on Goodreads and Amazon. And as I said earlier, this book contains important stories of experiences of real people that need to be told, to be shared, and more importantly, to be remembered. So thank you again for coming out tonight and hearing about their stories.